there are all kinds of reasons why Trump won't be able to rule America like Putin rules Russia. But he certainly admires it. He looks up to people like Putin and to Xi. And of course, his own corruption and kleptocracy resemble that we see in Russia or in Angola or in Zimbabwe. What we're seeing is Trump, and not only Trump, but others around Trump, taking advantage of their political power and using it to enrich themselves in ways that are really off the charts. And this again puts the Trump administration in the world of the autocracies. The intention is a kind of regime change. They want the American government to function differently from the way it does now. They want it to be their government. The other thing I think that's really hard to understand and accept, aside from the fact that he's seeking to destroy the American government administration, is that Trump doesn't have a strategy.
And we're talking about your book, Autocracy Incorporated. It's out now in paperback, but when it was first published, it was right after, it was in July 2024. It was in July. So you made a few predictions about Trump in this book. How many of them have come true?
I was trying to situate Trump in a kind of sliding scale. I was trying to explain not just who are the autocrats in the world and how they work together, but what are the autocratic practices that you can find now in democratic societies. And Trump is the epitome of several of them. His business career was partly built on money that came into his real estate companies through shell companies, so anonymously. So he was a big beneficiary of anonymous money. His campaign was then a big beneficiary of anonymous money. He's someone who learned very early on also how to use authoritarian style propaganda. So although he's not himself an autocrat, he adopted early on many of the practices that other autocrats use. And so the idea that he would, as president, become somebody who mixed economic and political power, for example, as modern autocrats do, and use the power of office to make himself rich or make other people around him rich. I think it was pretty clear to me that was going to happen, and that's happened.
I think take us back a little bit. So can you explain to me, what is Autocracy Incorporated? What is the theory? And does Trump want to be a part of it?
So Autocracy Inc. was a metaphor. It was a name that I came up with to describe a group of countries who are not an alliance, but who work together in various ways. And they have different ideologies and different aesthetics and different language. So we're talking about nationalist Russia and communist China and North Korea and Venezuela and Iran. These are really different places. But they began over the last decade to find that they had certain kinds of things in common. And they faced a common threat, and the threat was from us, basically. I mean, from the democratic world and from the language of the democratic world. So all of them have opposition movements that use the language of rights or the language of freedom or the language of transparency and accountability. And all of them understood that they need to fight back against those things, not only inside their countries, but around the world. They also had financial interests in common. They used this world of anonymous companies and offshore money and money laundering also in similar ways. They began to have financial interests in common. They have some political interests in common. Now they have some military interests in common. And they have a common interest in undermining, as I said, the democratic world as we know it, changing the rules. They don't like the rules of the current system. They don't like the fact that human rights law is built into all international institutions or human rights language. They don't like international law. They would like to be able to act abroad as they do at home, namely without checks and balances, without courts, without criticism, without independent media. And Trump is an admirer of that world. I don't know that he will be part of it. The United States has a very complex democracy, and there are there's a very old court system, and there are all kinds of reasons why Trump won't be able to rule America like Putin rules Russia. But he certainly admires it. He looks up to people like Putin and to Xi. He's also gone already pretty far in dismantling a lot of the tools that America once used to promote democracy and to promote the language of democracy. And of course, his own corruption and kleptocracy resemble that we see in Russia or in Angola or in Zimbabwe. And that seems to be deliberate. So it's not as if it's not like he's going to join this group, but he admires it and emulates it.
So talk to me a little bit about that. When Trump first took office, there was a lot of conversation around how he was sort of making his personal security stay in his hotels. During his last administration, we saw foreign powers were being encouraged to stay on his properties, and people were arguing that this was corrupt. I suppose from a rather English perspective, where we like to perhaps have a little bit more transparency than the US system does, and we were arguing that you were actually just self-serving by putting that money back into your own properties. But this is on a sort of larger scale now with his administration. How is he becoming a kleptocrat?
So this is, you're right to point out those incidents from his first term, because he essentially got away with that. So, for example, the Trump Hotel in Washington, as it then was used by foreign dignitaries. They would stay there and run up big bills as a way of kind of tipping him, I suppose. There was even a scene where there was a moment when Mike Pence was in Ireland. I can't remember now what the occasion was, and he went many miles out of his way in order to stay at a Trump hotel in Ireland as a way of, I don't know, enriching or honoring or something the president. All that was pretty new in the American system, actually. But it wasn't considered so important that anyone needed to do anything about it, and he essentially got away with it. This time around, what we're seeing is Trump, and not only Trump, but others around Trump, taking advantage of their political power and using it to enrich themselves in ways that are really off the charts. So Trump has a cryptocurrency company, World Liberty Financial, which essentially everybody who invests in it makes the price of this is a meme coin, makes the price of the company go up. So, and it looks like now people will deliberately invest in that company in order to curry favor with Trump, in order perhaps to get a better tariff deal or to get an investigation stopped or a regulation stopped. It looks like people are looking for ways. It doesn't just look like it. It is sort of, people are looking for ways to pay Trump or to get his or his businesses or his kids in order to get some favor from the U.S. government. I mean, there are all kinds of examples too. Actually, there's a golf tournament that was played at Trump's golf club a few weeks ago, and the tournament is sponsored by Saudi companies. And so at Trump's golf club and at his hotel in Florida, the head of the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund and a bunch of other Saudi state companies were staying. They were his paying guests. I mean, again, in a previous administration, nobody would have allowed that to happen because it looks like there's a foreign country who is paying money to the president personally in order to get time and attention and so on with him. But there are other things too. Elon Musk, for example, who had this role, for the last several weeks of being the person who was supposedly involved in the U.S. government in order to make it more efficient. He was someone whose companies have enormous interests in U.S. government decisions. So he had power over regulatory agencies that regulate his companies, Starlink and Tesla, and also power over agencies that were subsidizing his companies and his rivals. So you were actually putting somebody in charge of regulatory and financial government decisions, which are meant to benefit all of us, but who had a personal interest in how these things came out. And actually, there are multiple examples of this all around the government.
He was effectively self-regulating.
Yeah.
Because he had, some minor disputes before around pollution and these other sort of infractions.
Yep.
So was he able to almost, let himself off?
I mean, I don't know the answer to all of that yet, but certainly in theory, yes. I mean, he was firing people who were responsible for fining Tesla or Starlink for breaking rules. Yeah. I mean, if you can fire the bureaucrat who's causing you trouble, that's a lot of power.
And what do those cuts look like on the ground? When you're looking at USAID, those sort of cuts, how has that been felt in Washington? I know that you do spend quite a lot of time there.
Yeah, no, it's partly in Washington, partly I live in Poland. Look, I mean, the cuts to USAID it's not just how they're felt in Washington, it's how they're felt around the world. They've been catastrophic. I've seen estimates that say this year alone, many thousands of people will die because of USAID, food support for refugees and other things being cut, for healthcare all over Africa. There was a big AIDS program the U.S. supported that's being cut. And some of the cuts will also be reflected in other places. So something like 40% of the world's humanitarian aid came from the U.S., but the U.S. also did a lot of logistics for the world's aid services. So if you talk to someone, many people who think they weren't getting money from the U.S. or they weren't dependent on USAID suddenly discovered that the trucking or the logistics company who was delivering food somewhere or doing some task for them suddenly lost their money too. So it's created this breakdown all over the system, and of course USAID was an important source of American influence and what was called soft power. And the lack of that and the speed with which it was destroyed will have enormous impact. I mean, of course, the strangest thing about these aid cuts, not just aid cuts, sorry, but all of the so-called efficiency cuts, is relatively speaking, they haven't saved much money. They'll cost money because of people being illegally fired or contracts illegally terminated. There will be lawsuits. Government will have to pay them back. They may well result in the government becoming more efficient. Things like air traffic control, people are worried about. That if you cut lots of air traffic controllers, you begin to have problems. Park service, all kinds of institutions where people rely on park rangers being available in case of emergencies are also being undermined. So you're going to begin to see problems in strange places all over the country. You will not have saved a lot of money. And what it really looks like Musk was trying to do, and this again puts the Trump administration in the world of the autocracies, was frighten and scare and dominate the civil service. So make civil servants feel uncomfortable and unhappy, make all of them be afraid that they were going to be fired, and replace them eventually with loyalists, with people who were not working for the government or for the civil service because they care about delivering services to the American people, but because they're loyal to Trump. So the U.S. has had since the late 19th century this meritocratic civil service. Doesn't always function the way it's supposed to, obviously, but the rules, like rules here, were set up to at least encourage people to be apolitical and to be professional. And the Trump administration is rapidly seeking to change the civil service so that it's a body of loyalists to them.
This might be the first time that America has been ahead of the UK, because that's something that the Conservative or the last Conservative administration worked on for a long time, was to demonize and denigrate the civil service here. And there was a number of cuts made actually during austerity that we're now 10 years later really feeling the full force of. But I mean, you partially answered this question because but in terms of what their desired effect is of these cuts, you say that, there's not actually going to be potentially not a lot of fiscal benefit to the cuts because of repercussions. What is the intention? I know that you've written about Elon Musk and Donald Trump being the new Rasputins. Is it somehow connected?
I think the intention is a kind of regime change. They want the American government to function differently from the way it does now. They want it to be their government. They want it to be to benefit them. I mean, in the case of Musk, literally to financially benefit him. Different people around Trump want different things. I mean, there are some people who want the whole U.S. government to be run much more like a business, and so the government essentially funds, for example, projects that Silicon Valley wants. There's some people around Trump who want to eliminate the secular state and make the government more religious. There's a little group of people who want that. There's some people who want to dismantle the government because they don't like government and they come from parts of the country who've always seen the federal government as evil. So there are different, contradictory movements inside that group. But the impulse to destroy it and undermine it is one that they all share. Hard to get your mind around.
It is a little bit, and you know, what a terrible time to do it while we're on camera. I'm trying to work it all out, because I thought, to what end? You know, if he gets to the end of this administration and he's completely obliterated your civil service, and you know nothing is working with its intended function, what happens then?
Well, the question is whether, I guess, as somebody, a friend of mine said recently, they are acting like there isn't going to be another kind of government, that they're going to be there for a long time. So maybe their intention is the one that we would suspect they would have in another country, which is just, stay there and run the government for their own benefit indefinitely. I don't think our democratic system is that weak yet, but I'm sure there are people around him who hope it will be. But I think longer term, as I said, there are different versions of what will happen. Longer term, the idea is that there should either be no government or very little government, or the government should benefit a few people who are well placed to earn money out of it.
If Trump is realigning away from the democratic world, was the UK wrong to pursue this special relationship? I mean, over the last couple of months, we've seen, Trump shouting at Zelensky in the Oval Office. That was a scene that was not well received over in Europe.
It wasn't well received in a lot of the US either.
Well, it's good to hear, really, isn't it? You know, that we were all on the same page. But if he is moving away from the democratic world and the current world order, are we right to continue aligning ourselves with the US?
So like every other European government, there's a difficult balance, right? I mean, because nobody wants the US to do something drastic or pull all the American troops out of NATO, or create some huge break. And so I understand that everybody wants some kind of relationship with Trump. And also the US-European relationships and US-UK relationships are so deep, and they are academic and business and, intelligence. I mean, there's so many layers to it that it's not something that I think even one president can break up entirely. So I understand the impulse to be in touch. I just hope that everybody who is seeking to do deals with Trump is doing so with a healthy sense of skepticism and understanding that they might ultimately fail. And I hope that they are looking for other allies. I mean, the UK will need European allies. It'll need allies among the Asian democracies. There's Canada. There are, and making sure that all of those relationships are deep and stable, and that the trading relationships are real, is going to be very important as a way of living through the turmoil of the next 3 years.
There's a heavy focus in the UK over whether Trump will resolve the Ukraine and Russia conflict, whether that will be solved in the coming days. Do you think that, can Trump be seen as a reliable narrator? The sort of conversations that we're having here are, well, Trump is now he's now on the side of Zelensky, and he's moved away from feeling that Putin is some sort of deity that he must have a special relationship with. Do you think any of that talk has weight to it, or can he shift?
So it just so happens about 10 days ago, I was in Ukraine, and I was in a room full of Ukrainian journalists and editors. It was a kind of conference. And I asked, is there anybody in this room who thinks that there's going to be a ceasefire soon? And nobody raised their hands. The Russians have not talked about a ceasefire. Putin has never said he wants a ceasefire. The Russians are not acting like they want to stop the war. They haven't dropped their war aims, which continue to be the occupation and destruction of Ukraine. And so it's almost like there's one conversation happening in Washington and in the ether and among people, journalists who are writing about it. There's some kind of thing happening and negotiations going, but on the ground, actually nothing has changed. And nobody who really follows the conflict and who understands what Putin is doing believes it will change. So it's a very weird thing where Trump has actually successfully, I think, created this alternative reality where there are peace talks and negotiations that don't actually exist. And then on the ground, there's nothing there. The other thing I think that's really hard to understand and accept, aside from the fact that he's seeking to destroy the American government administration, is that Trump doesn't have a strategy. So he doesn't think strategically or geopolitically. He doesn't think, well, if I do, if I let Ukraine be defeated by Russia, then that will have an impact on how China sees Taiwan. I mean, that's not how he thinks. He thinks very much in the present. So every conversation that he has to win. So if he's in the room with the president of South Africa or the president of Ukraine, he has to emerge from that conversation as the victor. And he doesn't think about the further implications of that. So if he shows fake pictures to the president of South Africa that show a white genocide that didn't happen, that, of course, has implications, and it has implications for how America is perceived in Africa and how America's for future relations with South Africa. But he doesn't care about any of that. His interest is in winning the moment, and in using and in creating chaos that he can then use to manipulate people for his own political and maybe financial benefit. And it's really hard to get people to understand that that's what the US president is doing, that he doesn't have a deep strategy. I mean, it may be that people are right, that he'll be frustrated because Putin, who he imagines is his friend, keeps bombing Ukraine, even though he told him not to. I mean, maybe he'll, in a burst of anger, say, right, let's have sanctions on Russia, maybe, or more sanctions on Russia, maybe. But he won't do that as part of a concerted strategy to end the war.
That feels rather juvenile.
Yeah.
You can sort of understand perhaps why the European mind can't comprehend that.
Many American minds can't comprehend it.
Got a line towards the end of your book where you talk about Americans would do well with your long history of imagining yourselves to be exceptional, would do well to remember that your domestic politics have always been connected to and influenced by a larger struggle for freedom and the rule of law around the world. Does Trump remember that? Because what you're essentially saying is he's only trying to win the argument within the room. He's not perceiving anything
he's
outside
very
of it.
much so. He's very much not interested in being the leader of the democratic world. He is not interested in the connection between politics in America and politics in the outside world. On the contrary, as I said, he's attracted to autocratic leaders with whom he feels he has more in common than piddling little European countries. And if anything, he finds the language of the autocratic world useful. I mean, what does he need to do in order to stay in power? What did he use to get power? He used language that undermined independent media and press. He used language that undermined courts. He denigrated the legitimacy, actually, of his political opposition, of his democratic opponents. He called them vermin, and he called them radical left Marxists when he was talking about people who are a normal part of the American political system. So he's spent a lot of time trying to undermine democratic institutions in America. And so is he bothered by the fact that that makes America look weaker around the world, or that makes us that loosens our links to the allies who made us strong? No, he doesn't care.
Then what was the interest in Italy? Because there seemed to be this heavy focus from Trump's administration in forging links with Meloni, and also, with the Vatican recently.
I think they're hoping that Meloni will prove to be a far-right leader like themselves. I mean, they're looking to promote the far right around the world. I don't know to what extent they're right about her. I mean, she's a more ambiguous figure, but they're looking for those kinds of partners. They like people who talk their language. I mean, as for the Pope, I think the interest in him is, first of all, that he's American, which is pretty surprising.
But even before that, you had J.D. Vance down there meeting.
Well, that was because the Pope the previous Pope, the late Pope, picked a fight with J.D. Vance. So J.D. Vance made a somewhat weird speech in which he said that Christianity tells us that we should first love our family, then our community, then the world. But implying that as Christians, our duty is to people immediately around us and not to other human beings. And this is an argument against immigration. We don't owe anything to anybody else on the planet. And Pope Francis, very unusually, made a statement contradicting J.D. Vance. He said, no, Christians believe that every human being has value. We don't rank our loyalties in that way. And Christianity has a long tradition of welcoming strangers and lifting up the people who are the most impoverished and most unlucky in the world, and we feel have a special loyalty or dedication or interest or responsibility rather for them. And so Francis actually contradicted the vice president. I think that Vance's visit to Rome was I'm not quite sure what it was for. Was maybe one of the last people who saw the Pope actually, was meant to somehow heal that gap. I mean, Vance is a Catholic convert. Quite a large part of the intellectual far right in America are also Catholics. In Catholicism, you don't get to choose who your leader is, so the Pope matters, even if you disagree with him. And I expect it was part of that. I mean, this is why the choice of the current Pope, which by the way I think has nothing to do with U.S. politics, it's just that he had a large support among especially other Latin American Catholics because he spent most of his career in Peru. But I think it might be he might have an interesting influence on U.S. politics. We'll see.
Do you think when J.D. Vance is well, reimagining the Bible and Christian teaching, amongst other proclamations that he makes, do you think that he knows people are listening, or people who can correct him are listening? Or perhaps is this administration sort of in the business of what they say is mantra and it will go and no one will correct them?
I think what they're seeking to do is create a world in which the disagreements with them aren't heard, that their reality is the only reality. You know, they've recast the White House press corps so that it includes propagandists who will simply repeat whatever they say. They're looking to put pressure on American big television stations and some newspapers as a way of making sure there's an echo chamber around them. No, I don't think they want to hear criticism. I think that, and one of the ways in which they hope to retain power is by undermining even the idea of criticism, not taking criticism seriously. Not even when, for example, when a few weeks ago, the Secretary of Defense was texting accidentally a journalist, but also his family and lots of other people, the war plans of the U.S. military. The Trump administration was very keen not to sack him, not to fire him, not to reprimand him, because they don't want to give the impression that any criticism or that any wrongdoing can be attached to them. They want to just resist everything. We don't hear anything. We're untouchable.
The mechanism of the propagandist in the White House briefing room is very interesting. There was, I think the first was Natalie Winters, wasn't it, from Steve Bannon's War Room. Having a propagandist in there, what effect does that have on the room or on dialogue? Like, I mean, if you're an American citizen watching it, are you pleased that this sort of quote unquote journalist is now present in the room? Is there an anger at traditional journalism and traditional media outlets that?
Well, there's been over a decade or really more. I mean, over 2 decades, there has been constructed a huge argument against journalists, that journalists are biased, that there's no such thing as objective journalism, that and of course journalism is flawed, and traditional media is maybe very flawed, and there are the world of soundbite television maybe even on its way out. But in particular, but the attempt to create distrust and to build doubt has been one of the biggest projects of the American far right, as I said, for a long time. And again, the purpose of that is clear. The purpose is to create a world in which only they are heard, and in which contradictions aren't nobody hears the contradictions, nobody can correct them, nobody can check facts. I mean, maybe, I don't know if you remember, during the campaign last summer, there was a debate between J.D. Vance and Mike Waltz, and there was a moment when one of the people interviewing Vance corrected him slightly. This was to do with the Haitians who were supposed to be eating dogs and cats. Do you remember this fine moment in American politics? And Vance says, wait, there isn't supposed to be fact checking. So they want to live in a world where there's no fact checking.
Would that be terrible?
I mean, it would mean that there's no critical conversation, there's no nuanced debate, there's no, and that would be a world in which politics has no relation to reality, in which it kind of goes off into its own world. And I mean, and that is actually what autocratic societies often look like, where the political conversation has nothing to do with the reality that most people experience.
Let's pull back a little bit to the book itself. The opening chapter, you talk about how we have created people like Putin, or we facilitated Putin. Can you explain what you mean by that?
I mean, how did Putin come to power? I mean, very, very crudely, it was it was more complicated than what I'm about to say, but more or less what he did was, starting when his job as deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, he was part of this generational project of people who took money one way or the other out of the Russian state. They laundered it abroad, usually, always actually, through Western financial companies, Western businesses. Then often they brought the money back into Russia and they used it to buy property when it was being privatized. And that describes more or less what many thousands of people did who had some position in the previous regime, or who were simply understood what was going on and were able to take advantage of it. We, meaning we broadly, we the Western world, or we Western finance, we the City of London, we Wall Street, played a big part in that. We facilitated the money laundering. We helped the money get out and get back in again. We helped the Russians and the Kazakhs and others invest their money in, whether in London property or in stocks and bonds, or whatever. We allowed a stolen Russian company to be floated on the stock exchange. It was a oil company called Yukos. It was confiscated by the Russian state. This was the billionaire Hodorkovsky had owned it. He was arrested, put in prison. The company was taken over, massaged, given a new profile, and then, as I say, floated on the London Stock Exchange with every famous investment bank in the country, and probably some in the world, helping out. And so we really facilitated the process. We allowed the autocratic world, in particular Russia, although not only, we allowed them to build the system that they now have. And you can look at it on a smaller scale in lots of other places. The world of money laundering, of secret companies, of secret bank accounts, this is a world that we built, and we made it possible. And of course, we could also make it not possible. We could change the rules, we could change the laws, and we could put it to an end.
Has that made sanctions on Russia more or less effective?
Of course, it's made them less effective. I mean, there's so many ways to hide money, so many ways around sanctions. I should say, I don't think sanctions are useless. I mean, sanctions have had a big effect on Russia's ability to produce weapons. Slowed them down. It's had other effects on the economy, but they've had an impact. But the impact has been hampered both by the fact that there are so many workarounds, and also by the fact that sanctions busting is now a kind of group project. I mean, it's back to the Autocracy Inc. concept. Russia works with China. Russia works with other members of the autocratic world in order to get around sanctions, and in order to find ways of whatever it is, importing components for their, to build artillery. And this is not unique. There are some very strange relationships in the world that are explained only by the need to get around sanctions. For example, Venezuela and Iran are, you would not think, if you look at a map or you look at the path of world history, you wouldn't think that these are two countries that have very much in common. Kind of Bolivarian socialist Venezuela and theocratic Iran. Actually, they've worked together very closely. The Iranians have helped the Venezuelans import oil technology that they need, that they were restricted by sanctions. Venezuelans, in turn, have helped the Iranians with visas. They get visas for Hezbollah operatives who are supported by Iran. So they find ways to cooperate in the sort of outside of the mainstream economy and outside of the system. So yeah, that world of secret money, of secret bank accounts, and of untransparent finance has helped all of them a lot.
Is this why you say there's no liberal world order anymore?
I mean, the liberal world order was always an ideal, to be clear. You can point to many moments when it didn't work, but the sort of the dream of rule of law, the idea that there were institutions like the UN who could come in and run a peacekeeping operation or a negotiation. I mean, I think we're coming to the moment when we have to say that those things really don't work at all anymore. There actually hasn't been a UN peacekeeping operation since 2014. There aren't really UN projects to end any current wars. I mean, there's no international involvement in Gaza that matters. There's no international involvement in Sudan that matters. The UN has played no role in the Russia-Ukraine conflict of any real importance. I mean, in some minor ways. And what we now have instead is we have a group of countries. We have Russia, again, Russia, China, Iran, and others who would like there to be a different kind of world order. And by that, and sometimes Russia uses the word multipolarity. Sometimes they use other kinds of language. But what they would like to have is a world in which nothing hampers them. In other words, that the impunity that they enjoy at home, the ability to do whatever they want without any checks and balances, without courts, without journalists, without transparency, where that is transferred to the international stage. So Russia can invade Ukraine and there are no consequences. And maybe eventually China could invade Taiwan and there are no consequences. And so they've been working hard on dismantling all those rules and all that language for a long time. And I think, and we helped also in some ways. The U.S., I think, invasion of Iraq, which also was part of that process. And I think it's time to acknowledge that it doesn't work anymore and to begin to think about what comes next.
The sort of the treatment, the American treatment of some Iraqi soldiers, I think that, I mean, did America sort of blow the world order, the liberal world order themselves by not keeping to?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they're part of a larger deterioration. Yeah.
And is this I mean, you're talking about a potential new, a new order that needs a reconfiguration, but are we not in a space perhaps where Trump looks at what Russia is envisioning about no journalists investigating if they decide to, to take part in an illegal invasion? Is that not a future that Trump would aspire to?
Oh, he may well aspire to it. I mean, some of Trump's language about Greenland sounds a lot like Russia's language about Ukraine. So I don't want to make the direct comparison because Trump hasn't, killed thousands of people or kidnapped any children. So I don't want to. There's no direct analogy. But the way the Trump and Vance have spoken about Greenland as being somehow fake or not real, or easily underminable, or it should be ours, or we can take it if we want. I mean, this is how the Russians spoke about Ukraine. It's a fake state. It's not a real country. Its laws don't matter. And this way of looking at the world, that any country, big countries can invade little countries with impunity. This is very much how the autocrats would like the world to be. They would like to be in a world where it's okay for Russia to just take over Lithuania, and there's nothing anybody can really do about it. The fact Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Greenland has elected members of the Danish parliament. The Greenlanders are Danish citizens. The United States has long-standing treaties with Greenland. It's not as if there's nothing there, but acting like there's nothing there, like it's all fake, like it can be destroyed in a minute. This is an autocratic way of thinking. And yes, I think Trump does aspire to that. I don't know that he thinks about it consciously, that that's what he's doing. As I say, what he's most interested in is winning every contest in the moment. I don't know that he has a long-term plan or strategy, but yeah, he would like to be able to act without constraint the way they do.
I can't remember if you said it before we started recording or whether we've said it during this interview, but you were talking about how Trump has no grand plan, and that's probably the most frightening realization, I think, for a lot of people, that we still have to digest.
No, he doesn't have a grand plan. He doesn't think that way. He doesn't think about how one action will echo in history. He doesn't think about how the past explains the present. He doesn't think about how the power of example. So again, if Russia were to invade and occupy Ukraine, what that would mean for other places. He just doesn't. His brain doesn't work that way. And again, for rational people, for business people, for other politicians, this is very hard to understand.
And on that ominous note, the book is out in paperback.
Thank you.
Thank you.